Welcome to the sew along for the Geri open back dress developed in collaboration with Yabbies, and you may purchase the PDF pattern from the link in the description box below. Thanks for tuning into my channel, Geri in Stitches. This is Geri and I designed this dress, which is a pattern for knit fabrics with four-way stretch. It has a halter neck, wrap front bodice, and features a cutout in the back. There are three skirt lengths to choose from: mini, midi, or maxi. It's a great summer dress and can be dressed up or down. Today I will show you the sewing order and techniques required to sew this up, so follow along and let's get started. For this sew along, I am choosing to work with a viscose jersey print with beautiful drape. I recommend using knit fabrics with at least 30% stretch on the grain line and on the cross grain. I made a dress in velvet rib knit and another in floral swimsuit fabric. The elastane content in the fabric prevents the fabric from stretching out of shape, where two knots are tied to hold the dress up on the body. There are only 4 pattern pieces for this dress pattern. We need to cut 4 fabric pieces for the front bodice, which means we're cutting 2 mirrored pairs. And here's the back strap, and 4 fabric pieces have to be cut out as well. Again, we're cutting 2 mirrored pairs, and we have to cut 1 front skirt on the fold. But what I like to do is to add a mirrored half to the paper pattern so that I can cut the fabric out on a single layer. This goes the same for the back skirt pattern, which has to be cut on the fold. It's really more accurate to cut knit fabrics on a single layer. Elastic is used to stabilize the seams, so pick one that best resembles the weight and movement of your knit fabric. For example, this elastic I'm holding on the left side of the screen will go better with my lighter weight knit compared to the one on the right. Also, it's best to work with elastic that is 6 millimeters wide so that it can be sewed into the 1 centimeter seam allowance. Finally, you can also use clear elastic for sturdier knits. Experiment with scraps and see what works best. For the larger fabric pieces, I like to use my LDH fabric shears to cut them out. For the smaller pieces, I prefer the LDH rotary cutter. The affiliate link for these fantastic prism scissors and super sharp blades are in the description box below. Thanks for your support! The next step of marking is crucial for me for good results. I like to mark all my seam lines and notches for accurate sewing at the regular sewing machine or at the serger. Also, I don't like cutting into notches, especially when the seam allowances are narrow. I mark all my seam lines on all my fabric pieces. I know it's very nerdy, but it really elevates the sewing experience for me. And when the fabric pieces are all cut up and marked, then we're ready to start sewing. It is optional to add foam cups to your bodice, but if that's what you want, this is the first thing to do. Position the cups and pin them to the inner bodice pieces. The best position for me is about 1.5 to 2 centimeters away from the bottom seam line. Adjust this based on how best it will fit you. Then sew the cups to the inner bodice pieces at the machine with a zigzag stitch or a triple zigzag stitch all around the edges of the cups. Sewing the foam cups into the bodice gives me better coverage and support, and removes the need to wear a special halter bra with this garment. With right sides together, align and pin together the neckline edges of one of the outer and inner front bodices. The neckline is the steeper and longer curve on this pattern piece. I like to sew the seam at the regular sewing machine with a lightning stitch, which is meant for knit fabrics. However, you can also do this with a narrow zigzag stitch if your machine doesn't have this option. A third option is to sew this at the serger, and I encourage you to experiment with your fabric scraps after cutting to decide which option is best for you. When that's done, then I install elastic on the length of this seam. Now I make sure that I do not sew the elastic into any of the seam allowances in order to reduce bulk at the seams. Also, I stop about an inch or 2 away from the tip of the strap. When I'm installing the elastic, I apply slight tension on the elastic while pinning, so that when I am at the machine, the elastic will be sewn on with slight tension. I do this a little bit more along the deeper curve of the neckline as well. I am pinning the elastic very close to the seam line, and also notice that I am pinning parallel to the seam line because I prefer to sew the elastic on at the serger. You can also sew this with a zigzag or triple zigzag stitch at the regular machine. Applying slight tension on this seam will prevent stretching in the future or a wavy seam at this bias cut neckline. In addition, these seams hold the weight of the dress on the body because of the halter, and they need the elastic for stabilization. I like to install the elastic with the serger because it conveniently trims off the excess seam allowance at the same time. However, you can also do this by sewing the elastic at the regular sewing machine with a zigzag or triple zigzag stitch. This task can be finicky, so go slow, have patience, and you'll get there. I hope you can see that I am stretching the elastic just a little as I am sewing along. And I make sure that I am stretching only the elastic and not the fabric as well. When the elastic is installed, the end result shows that the seam isn't very gathered up by the fabric actually. It looks almost flat. If no tension was applied at all, then there's the risk of the seam stretching out at this point in the sewing. After this, we will understitch by sewing the seam allowance towards the side of the inner bodice. And I use a triple zigzag stitch on the regular sewing machine for this task, but you can also use a regular zigzag stitch. I make sure that there's a very slight tension applied and that the fabric passes flat as it goes under the presser foot. And I keep checking that the seam allowance is pushed towards the side of the inner bodice. Understitching prevents the inner bodice from rolling towards the outer bodice, and when this is complete, this seam will be finally done. Many seams of the bodice will go through this three-part sewing process. First, sewing the seam on the regular machine. Second, installing the elastic in the seam allowance at the serger. And third, understitching the seam. When the neckline seam is done, then we will move on to the armhole seam, going through the three-step process that I just described. So here we go. With right sides together, we will align, pin, and sew the armhole seam at the regular machine. Then we will pin on the elastic in the seam allowance close to the seam line. I place slight tension on the elastic as I go along and apply a little bit more tension on the elastic along the curve of the armhole. This will be brought to the serger to be sewn, completing the second step. The third step here is the tricky part because we won't be able to understitch all the way through. Just do your best and understitch close to the seam line, taking care that the seam is moved over to the side of the inner bodice and sew till you can't go any further. And that's it. The bodice can now be turned to the right side. You may trim off any excess seam allowance at the tip of the strap and turn out the bodice with your preferred method. As you can see, the understitching only goes so far, and that's sufficient for keeping the inner bodice from rolling towards the front. At this point in time, it's a good idea to press the seams, and any leftover waviness should be ironed out. The first side of the front bodice is done, and now we can move on and sew the other front bodice in the same way. And next, we will tackle the back straps. With right sides together, align the top edges of an inner and outer back strap. The top edge is the one that is the straight line on this pattern piece. Pin and sew this seam. Then install elastic on the seam, remembering to stay clear of the seam allowances and applying some tension on the elastic when sewing. Next, understitch the seam allowance on the side of the inner back strap, sewing close to the seam line. Then we will sew up the bottom edge. Again, this seam will go through the three-part treatment. Align the edges, pin and sew the seam. Then install elastic, remembering to avoid sewing the elastic into the seam allowances. Apply slight tension to the elastic when sewing this in, and I apply a little bit more when going around the curve of this seam. When understitching the seam allowance at the bottom edge, you will not be able to do this all the way to the tip of the strap. Just understitch as far as you can, and this will be enough to keep the inner strap fabric from shifting towards the front. Just make sure that the seam allowance stays on the side of the inner bodice while understitching. Trim off the extra seam allowance at the tip of the strap, and you can see here that the understitching is about 3 to 4 inches long. Now we are ready to turn the fabric right side out with your preferred method. I simply just stick my fingers in and maneuver the right side out. Give the strap a good pressing at the ironing station, and when that's done, go ahead and sew up the other back strap in the same way that you did to the first. What's next is to attach the front bodice to the back strap at the side seam. With the right sides facing together, pin this seam aligning the edges. Match the seam lines and the notches. I like to sew this seam in two passes, each time starting from the matching seam lines that connect the inner bodice to the outer bodice. So when I pin, I am only pinning half of the seam first. I do this in two passes because this will ensure that the seam lines are matched nicely. Often when sewing with knits, the fabric will shift under the pressure foot, especially at the seam lines, and I find this method works best for matching the seam lines accurately. I go to the machine to sew the first pass, moving from seam lines to the bottom edge. Then I flip my work to the other side, pin the seam from the seam line to the bottom edge, and complete this seam, the side seam, by sewing the rest of it in the second pass. By the way, I am using a lightning stitch for knit fabrics on my machine to sew the seam, but you can also use a narrow zigzag stitch or bring this to the overlocker or serger. And there it is! The side seam is sewn with seam lines matching perfectly at the cross point. Hooray! We can now assemble both completed bodices together once the other side seam is sewn. Pin the two bodices together. Match the center front notches, and you will also find that the tips of each bodice will match with a corresponding notch on the opposite side. Pin and hand baste this seam within the seam allowance because there are many layers to attach here. Hand basting for me minimizes shifting of the layers and will help with more accurate sewing at the machine later. When the hand basting is done, then we can move on to preparing the skirt section of the dress. If you are sure about the length of the skirt, then I suggest reinforcing the hem of the front and back skirt now with a strip of fusible knit interfacing. The width of the interfacing is the same as the hem allowance. Next, the curve of the back cutout has to be reinforced with elastic. To do this, I first measure the length of the curve. Whatever the measurement is, I mark that on a piece of elastic. The required length of elastic will be about 85% of the length of the curve. I calculate this number on a calculator and mark that length on the elastic. After cutting the required length of elastic, then I use the quartering method to install the elastic to the curve of the back cutout. The quartering method involves dividing the elastic into four and marking these positions on the elastic. Then I also divide the curve of the back cutout into 4 quarters and mark those positions on the curve as well. Next, I match the corresponding quarter points of the elastic to the curve of the back cutout. Pin the elastic to the wrong side of the back skirt with its edge close to the seam line within the seam allowance, and the elastic is ready to be sewn onto the curve. When I am at the machine, I make sure that I am applying tension on the elastic so that the fabric is laying flat as it's passing under the presser foot. Only apply tension to the elastic when doing this. Try not to stretch out the fabric as much as possible. I am sewing the elastic on with a triple zigzag stitch, but it can also be done with a regular zigzag stitch. When that's done, then we can fold the seam allowance over so that the elastic is hidden. After trimming off the extra seam allowance, we can sew the second pass close to the raw edge of the fabric. Again, I am using a triple zigzag stitch, but this also works with a regular zigzag stitch. I am applying slight tension to the fabric so that it passes under the presser foot without any pleats and folds created in the fabric. When completed, there will be a slight gathering created by the elastic. Sewing on the elastic in this way reinforces this curve in the back cutout and prevents the curve from stretching out in the future. Okay, the back cutout is reinforced and now we're ready to sew the side seams of the skirt. With right sides facing, align the side seams of the back skirt to the side seams of the front skirt. Pin and sew these seams at the regular sewing machine or at the serger or overlocker. I prefer to sew these seams at the regular sewing machine with a lightning stitch or a narrow zigzag stitch, and I prefer to press open the side seams once they are sewn up. But you can also press these seams to one side if you've chosen to close them up with a serger or overlocker. I prefer to press them open so that it creates less bulk at the seams when sewing up the hem and also when attaching to the bodices. If you're already sure about the length of the skirt and have reinforced the hem with a strip of fusible interfacing, then you can choose to hem up the skirt now. I like to sew the hem of knit garments with a twin needle, and to prepare for this task, I usually press the hem at the hem fold line, then hand baste the hem first before I sew it at the machine. The basting stitch provides a guided line for me to top stitch the twin needle stitch so that I can make sure that I am catching the edge of the hem while sewing. You can also choose to close the raw edge of the hem before hemming it up at the serger. I prefer to leave mine raw in order to reduce thread buildup. When threading your twin needle, make sure the threads are not entangled. Set the machine on the regular straight stitch, and it's important to check for the right tension and stitch length on scraps of fabric before stitching on your actual garment. For example, I usually increase the stitch length to a setting of 3.5 when stitching the hem on knit fabrics, and this usually removes the tunneling that can occur with twin needle stitching. You can also do this task with a cover stitch machine if you happen to have one, but this twin needle hack at the regular machine works well for me. The hand basting stitches provide a great guide for me while top stitching with a twin needle on hems. When completed, check that the edge was caught by the stitching all the way around, and if there's some slight tunneling, this can usually be removed with some pressing with steam at the ironing station. Now that we've completed preparing the skirt, we are approaching the last step of attaching the skirt to the bodice. With right sides facing together, pin the skirt to the bodice. I like to match the center front notches first, then match the side seams. I prefer to sew this seam in two sections, from center front to the end of one side. Then I flip my work over and sew from center front again to the other side. This means that when I am pinning, I make sure the pins are running the right direction for this to happen. I do it this way to ensure that the side seams are matched properly, and because I am attaching many layers at the same time, this will minimize shifting of the layers when the fabrics pass under the presser foot. So to reiterate, when sewing at the machine, I sew from center front to one side, then flip my work, and then sew from center front to the other side. Admire your work when this is completed, then it's time to reinforce this underbust seam with elastic. In order for that to happen, the thickness in this seam has to be reduced first. There are many layers in between that can be trimmed off, and this will help reduce the bulk in this seam for easier sewing. The quartering method will be used once again to attach the elastic to the underbust seam. First, measure the length of the seam. The elastic length required will be 85% of the length of this seam. Calculate the length with the help of a calculator, then divide the required elastic length into 4 quarters. Mark these quarter positions. Next, divide the length of the seam into 4 quarters as well and mark these quarter positions. Match the corresponding quarter marks between the elastic and the seam. Pin the elastic on the wrong side of the skirt, close to the seam line. This way, when the seam is pressed down towards the skirt, the elastic will be hidden. At the machine, sew the elastic to the underbust seam with a triple zigzag stitch or a regular zigzag stitch. Remember to apply tension only to the elastic so that when the fabric goes under the presser foot, it is laying flat with no pleats or folds. Do your best to stretch only the elastic and not the fabric. When this is completed, you can also sew down the seam with another line of top stitching. I chose not to do this here to reduce thread buildup, but you may want to have this top stitching detail. If you haven't hemmed up the skirt, then go ahead and get that done, and your open back dress is now ready to be worn. This is the ultimate summer dress with the halter neck and back cutout. This easy to wear garment is perfect for relaxing poolside or at the beach. And I want to extend a big thank you to Yabbies for this opportunity to collaborate, and this PDF sewing pattern is now available for purchase in the link provided in the description box below. please use the hashtag Geri Open Back Dress on Instagram so that I can celebrate your creations. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching and happy sewing!